I'm Mike,
And I'm Amber. Welcome to the Covenant Chronicles,
where we tell you the truth about relationships.
giving you the tools to build the foundation you always needed. Welcome back to the Covenant Chronicles.
Are we recording or are we still laughing about the dog?
It's kind of still laughing about the dog. We were just trying to record. And our dog is in the background over here having a crazy dream. So we had to stop and restart. That was pretty funny, I'm not gonna lie.
That dog's something else. The best $42 I ever spent at the pound, I guess.
He's the best.
All right, well, on that note, welcome y'all. Welcome back. We use this time in this podcast as much to help you as we do almost a therapy session for ourselves, right? Because a lot of times we can use it to talk through stuff in our own lives and actually identify some stuff and work on some stuff. And it was pretty interesting because we had some really good conversations recently and we had some challenges that we overcame. And the interesting thing about those challenges was not only the way we handled them, but also the good conversations it led to afterwards, right? And that doesn't mean we necessarily handled the situations perfectly. And that's something that I feel is really important for us to share with folks because, sometimes we think that we have to be perfect or be to the finish line to be able to help, or to be able to provide valuable advice to people. But we've had that conversation before where, how many people are starting where we did years ago, right? Like years before our previous marriages ended, or, even at the beginning of our relationship, or even where we were even a year ago, right? And the massive progress that we've made, and you see it talked about in almost every aspect where when people start making progress, you don't see it initially, right? It's like going to the gym and you're working out and you're lifting and you're tracking your progress and you're tracking everything that you're eating. And you're like, man, after a few weeks, you're like, I don't see any results. And after a month or two, you're like, maybe I'm seeing results, and then after 6 months, you're like, okay, I can kind of see it, and then a year goes by and you're like, okay, I'm starting to see some results. But then you go back and look at pictures from a year ago and you're like, oh, okay, wow, that's a massive difference. Right. And I think relationships work a lot, or really anything in your life works a lot of the same way, in the sense that you might not initially see all the progress, but it adds up and it adds up and it adds up. Right. And
Yeah, for sure.
in our previous marriages, we started both working on ourselves. We've had this conversation where that was a pivotal point in the relationship where we really worked on ourselves, or identified that we needed to work on ourselves, and then started heading that direction, right? And we keep going towards this, almost like trying to stop the relationship from failing, and then it still failed, and then we move on and we're still working on ourselves, and then we hit the point where we get together and we're still working on ourselves and each other at this point. And it's like, oh man, I feel like I'm repeating these habits, and am I really making progress? And then you look at it and you identify like what we did this last weekend, right? Where we have disagreements, not just one, but a couple of them. And you look at, okay, how that was handled versus the people we were, say, years and years and years ago in our previous marriages.
Mm-hmm.
And even at the beginning of our relationship a few years back, right? And it's a massive difference in the way things are. So
For sure.
that being said, I wanted to identify some stuff and identify, I guess, some points in which you realize that maybe our communication wasn't so good, right? And then how did we move past that? But I want to go back to, before we get into that though, I do want to go back to maybe previous ways, right? Or things we've experienced in our past. And I think a lot of people will relate to that in the sense of, when we do start talking about, okay, well, this is what happened now and this is how we handled it. A lot of people will see that and say, oh, well, you know, that's great for you, but that doesn't work because this person does X, Y, and Z, or that person does X, Y, and Z. So maybe not even our previous marriage. Let's just use us at the beginning and identify some ways that we communicated that we were trying to work on and was like, wow, okay, this isn't right. But some of those examples of like, okay, this is really not what we want, right?
Hmm. I would say that we definitely struggled with our communication in the beginning. I think a lot because we didn't understand each other, but also because we did have different styles of communication and we hadn't yet figured out how to navigate that properly. And I think also we really still were working on the healthy communication because I think we still both were having unhealthy communication with our exes, which didn't help how we were communicating with each other because it kind of just carried over and we like that's just how we communicated. So we really had to work on understanding each other. And I think identifying how we both communicate, understanding honestly our attachment styles, which is another topic that we'll discuss another time. But I think that really ties into communication a ton, and especially healthy versus unhealthy communication, because like you have said before, like, and we kind of identified together, like, you were very avoidant in the relationship. And I kind of came into the relationship as a mixture of avoidant and anxious attachment. But that makes it hard because I started out being anxious in conversations that we weren't doing well in, and then I became avoidant, and you already had your avoidance side turned on. So then we got two avoidants going at each other, and that's a whole
Mm-hmm.
not great scenario. But in saying that, I think, when we talk about the different types of attachment styles, that'll really like tie into this well. But you really have to take that into account. And if you don't know what your attachment style is, like I would really say that's something you should go out and try to figure out before your next I say before your next argument, like you're gonna have an argument, but
Mm-hmm.
just knowing that information will really help you with communication down the road. But in saying all of that, like really figuring out those things with each other helped a lot with our communication. But I think we both still really struggled with like what is healthy communication versus what is unhealthy communication, because I don't think we really either of us had great like examples of what healthy communication is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I grew up around super great examples of that. I don't think you grew up around super great examples of that. So trying to figure out like how to actually have healthy communication was definitely like a very big learning curve for us. And that's not to say that we like always did it wrong in the beginning. I don't think we always did, but we definitely had times where we would get into that awful cycle of like you becoming avoidant and then me being anxious and then becoming avoidant, and like that messed with our communication so badly. So I would say like trying to figure out what healthy communication is for you, and how to navigate that is super important before like you even just like dive into like, oh, we need to change how we communicate. Like
Mhm.
there's some steps that you need to figure out beforehand that will really help you with that.
With that being said, I think people understanding how that looks from an outside perspective, though, can be a massive benefit. And in the beginning of our relationship, identifying what that looked like, where it was like, okay, this wasn't great or this wasn't how it should go, right? And maybe some of the internal thoughts or conversation that we had with ourselves, a lot of that would be, something that we'd be frustrated with, and maybe it's not even that big of a deal, or we made it seem like a bigger deal than it was, or at times it was a big deal.
Mhm.
um, and then we would get in this whatever, right, where whatever would spark it. And sometimes it's hard to identify, like, okay, what was that actual spark,
Mhm.
and usually it was one or both of us just not hearing and understanding what the other person was saying. And then that would start this snowball effect of trying to make the other person understand our side of things,
Mhm.
or, trying to prove that we were right. And it becomes this kind of back and forth dance of, or I don't even want to call it a dance, more like a duel, right? Of
Mhm.
trying to say, okay, well, no, my point of view is right. Well, no, you know, this is what I see, or this is what you did, or, this is wrong. And it was this kind of duel of all the things that we were doing wrong, and throwing those bricks at each other,
Mhm.
and also, not taking the time to actually listen to understand, okay, what's being said here. And then there's a whole nother component, especially I think guys struggle with this a lot too, and a lot more than we want to admit, right? Because what we'll do is, I think we fall into this pattern of, well, no, I admitted, you know, what whatever it was, right? I said that I was wrong here, but you still aren't, right? And playing this game instead of just saying, hey, look, I'm wrong, or hey, I understand that I didn't do this properly. I hear you, and trying to move forward, right? And so we had this duel, if you will, where we were owning our fault for the purpose of not necessarily actually owning our own crap and being like, okay, this is my part in this disagreement. But it was like almost just doing just enough work to try to convince the other person that they still need to see your point of view,
Mhm.
right? And we find ourselves doing that, or I guess not now, but we used to find ourselves in that pattern. And then, like you said, then the attachment styles come in. And like for me, like when it would get worse and worse and worse, and I couldn't get my point across, and you had your emotions flowing, and I would be in a heightened state of emotion, and I just wouldn't want to deal with it.
Mhm.
And for me, I would even say at times, like, I don't have the time to deal with this, or I'm not going to deal with this, or whatever.
Mhm.
Right. And I think that those are really important factors to take away of, like, we were working on figuring it out, but we didn't always know how to do it.
Yeah.
Right. But then you come to the place now of, like, this past weekend, we had some disagreements over some pretty big topics, and what would typically be a very hot button for us, and we didn't handle it right initially, in each one of these scenarios. But the vast difference is it wasn't this like duel of trying to prove who was right, and going back and forth and caring more about being right than what actually is right or being a team. We didn't do that, and when we did start to walk that line, or start to get maybe approaching that, either one or both of us would stop and say, hey, look, we're not being a good team right now. Right now, we're being adversaries. That's not what we want. Neither of us want that. So maybe we should table this, right? Maybe we should come back to this later. Let's go about our day. Let's go enjoy this time. And I know it's hard because, both of us have this emotional state going on, but let's move on. Let's go do this other thing and enjoy this time. And then we can come back to this. And we did. And the really interesting thing is we were, after that, during those moments of us trying to move on, we also didn't just move on and pretend it didn't happen, right? We would have a little bit of discussion of like, hey, this kind of made me feel this way during this time. And not like we were addressing the issue. It was just, hey, during this situation, this kind of made me feel this way, or this made me feel that way. And then a time of reassurance of us, reminding each other, hey, like, we're a team. We want to be here. We're not going anywhere. Like, we're not leaving.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to figure this out. And I
Mm-hmm.
want you to know that I love you. And, we're going to figure this out. And we're together. And neither of us are going anywhere. And I saw it on both sides, right? Which was really cool to see. And then you move into, okay, even later, hours and hours later, or even the next day when we come back to the actual issue, us saying, okay, and instead of having this situation of trying to tell you what you did wrong, or you trying to tell me what I did wrong, it was this identifying within ourselves where we could have been better, and then actually uplifting the other person and saying, hey, I see this in you. Our family needs this version of you.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we did a good job of this, but I know this is who you are,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is a vastly different situation than I think the trap that most people get caught in. And we've been there, of saying, no, you did this wrong.
Mm-hmm.
No, you talked to me wrong here. No, you said these wrong things.
Mm-hmm.
No, this and that, but and trying to prove this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those are vastly different things. And just changing your word choice a little bit in the midst of that can make a massive difference, right?
Yeah. I think in you talking about all of that, something that like kept popping in my head was like, we're talking about healthy versus unhealthy communication, and I really want to make a point of a couple things that like you brought up that really are unhealthy ways of communicating. And I think it's a lot of people do it in their communication. And if you can start to identify these things and be like, probably shouldn't do that. Let's try to work on not saying those things. But the words always and never, when
Mm,
you throw those into an argument or a
you
disagreement,
always, you never do.
mhm,
You're never,
yeah.
you always do.
And that always is going to trigger the other person, always,
Mm-hmm,
because you just automatically are feeling attacked.
mm-hmm,
um you talking about us reassuring each other like we're not going to go anywhere, that sort of thing. I think something that gets brought up in a lot of conversations also is throwing around like, oh, well, maybe we need to just get divorced, or
mm,
oh, like I need to leave or you need to leave, or just saying snide things that make the other feel like you're going to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people really do have a fear of, attachment and a fear of the other person leaving.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big thing for a lot of people. And I think a lot of people don't really mean it. They just throw it out
Mm-hmm.
and don't realize what it's actually doing to the other person.
You know, I, the one thing I would say about that though is I agree with you that they don't necessarily mean that they want to leave, but they do mean it in the sense of weaponizing it to gain control, right? Because it's a power trip and it's a control thing. And if you feel like you're losing control, human nature is to try and regain it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what that is, right? It's a tactic to say, well, let me put this fear of leaving this person
Mm-hmm.
into them to gain control of the situation.
Yeah, I guess honestly, I'd never even thought about it that way, but uh, for sure.
Hmm.
And I think that's a huge one. And it's so detrimental to a relationship, to be honest, because it really just puts so much insecurity in the relationship that doesn't need to be there. And, whether you mean it or not, like, unless you really mean in that moment, like, this is a really bad relationship and I need to get out of it, like, that shouldn't be something that you're bringing up and throwing out.
Hmm.
And obviously, I'm not saying, like, you shouldn't leave a relationship if it's bad, like, that's not really what I'm saying, but it definitely should not be something that's brought up every time there's an argument or
Hmm.
every time there's a disagreement. So that's really a huge, like, if you can take that out of your language during arguments and disagreements, will have that alone a huge impact on your disagreements.
Well, bringing up like the not saying thing, that's a perfect example of word choice though, and how it can make a big difference, right?
Mm,
And what are intentions behind what we're saying? Because a lot of times, like I said, like using that, oh, well, if you don't do, I'm just gonna leave.
mhm,
Right. Now here's the thing, right? Here's where you have to be careful in your word choice. That is an acceptable thing if you are in a position where you have worked on yourself, you have done what you need to do, and you are trying to basically you're in a marriage or you're in a relationship where there was an agreement and there was this, hey, you're this person, I'm this person, and your partner is no longer being that person. It is okay to say, hey, look, I want better for us. I'm doing this. If you cannot, you know, basically fulfill the promises that were made when we got married. And that's hard for some people to swallow, right? Because we'll probably get a bunch of flack for that. But I've told it to you too. Like if I get to a certain point, or if I get, to a point where, or if I ever, verbally abuse you or anything like that, like you 100% need to leave, right? Like that 100% should be on your list of like, this was not what was promised when we got in a relationship. Or, it could be other things, the way somebody's acting, there's various other things, and we can get into that another time. But when it comes down to picking our words, right, using that as a weaponization is a completely different thing.
mhm,
And then you also have to be careful because maybe you are feeling like you need space and you don't know how to deal with whatever situation it is, right? We had that talk over this last weekend because there was a situation where we didn't know how to deal with it, and we both were feeling overwhelmed and
mhm,
and didn't know how to add this in. And there was the way things were said of like, hey, I don't know how to deal with this. Like, if we can't do this, then this needs to be the solution. Or I wouldn't even say it was this needs to be the solution. It was more along, hey, if we can't do this, then here's the outcome. And due to our past and things that we've said or things we've experienced, right? It was like, okay, well, we just talked about this and not leaving and da da da. And then we had to take a step back and say, hold on, hold on, hold on. That's not what we're talking about, right? This is what we're talking about. And this is what the intentions behind that are. This is what we mean, right? And bringing that back and just being cautious of word choice, right?
Mhm.
Are two totally different things.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And I guess the way, even like we were talking about the way we handled thing after when we were talking about it, or when I mentioned we were talking about it, and it was uplifting, right? Saying, hey, I need you to be a leader here and you failed at it, versus our family needs you to be a leader. I see this in you.
Mhm.
This is who you are. You just said the same thing basically,
Mhm.
right? But one is tearing them down and trying to prove you're right, and the other is uplifting them and saying, hey, no, we're a team. I
Mhm.
know this is where we want to go. And there's a massive difference there in just word choice and the way you say things, right? So
Yeah.
even talking about the leaving thing, if you're feeling overwhelmed and like you need space, saying, hey, I'm completely overwhelmed right now. I don't know how to do this. And like, if we can't figure out a way to be a team, I need a little bit of space because this is like, it's too much.
Right.
Right. And that doesn't mean, hey, I'm going to run away and end the relationship. That's saying, hey, I need a little bit of space. But that's vastly different than being like, if you don't start communicating, I'm going to leave.
Right. But the healthy version of that also, just to kind of like point that out, is like you saying, "Hey, I need some space," should also be followed by, "Hey, I need some space, but can we come back to this in
Mm,
30 minutes, an hour,
hmm.
even like
Tomorrow.
tomorrow?" Yeah. Like, I want to still address this, but I think I need some space right now. Like, that's a healthy way of communicating and dealing with it, and not just like, "Hey, I don't wanna talk about this anymore,"
Hmm.
or, you know, "I'm not going to talk about this anymore," and then just trying to, like, completely end it.
Hmm.
So, that's a good distinction to make there of, like, a healthy way to communicate when you are feeling like you do need to, like, take some time.
Yeah. Well, and like we said, even like the leave thing, right? Hey, I need some space to just figure this out and calm down and sort out. And then putting some type of expectation of, hey, like I'm gonna go for a drive for about an hour. I'll be in back in an hour. We can do what, or hey, just give me some time in the bathroom. Or hey, I'm not in a good place to talk about this. Let's bring it back up tomorrow. Okay, let's take the rest of the day and kind of do our thing, but reassuring your partner of like, I still want to be your partner. I still want to be your teammate.
Mhm,
Because if you needing space is you saying, hey, if we can't communicate better, or if we,
mhm,
this, I can't do this anymore, so I'm just going to leave,
mhm.
right? Your intention may be, I just need space because I'm overwhelmed. But if
Right,
your partner has any sort of abandonment trauma or any sort of like fear of abandonment, right?
mhm,
Like that's once again a weaponization
right.
tactic,
Well, and
or creating, further trauma in them.
I think a lot of people struggle with that thing in particular because people do say, like, "I need some space," or "I need some time," and what happens is that it isn't ever brought back up to try and repair.
Mm-hmm.
And so people really struggle with that. And they're like, no, I need to finish this. We need to talk about this right now.
Mm-hmm.
And not understanding that sometimes it is really healthy to put a pause in it and come
Mm-hmm.
back to it. Because when you're in that disagreement and when you're arguing, your both of your emotions are high. And like we've talked about in previous stuff, women run on emotion, men run on logic. And when you're not communicating and not being heard, not feeling understood, like all of those things are super heightened in the moment. And to be like, hey, we're not communicating well. I just need, like, we need to stop. We need to pause. We need to have a little break for a bit and readdress this later is actually super healthy because it does give you time for your emotions to come down a bit, which then can really make you see things differently. Things that you thought were super important at that moment that you really needed to address could actually have not been that important, and it gives you a different perspective and you're able to process things and take it in and really figure out if what you were arguing about was even needed and if like what you actually needed to address in that situation. So I think that's an important distinction to make because honestly, I know I always struggled with that until very recently. Like, no, we're going to keep arguing until we
Mm-hmm.
figure out what the problem is and we fix it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was afraid that it was never going to get addressed again. It was just going to be swept under the rug. We were just going to move on.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't going to be any repair. And so it made me anxious and
Mm-hmm.
I needed to fix it and solve it in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I realize now that we do so much better when we actually do pause and we do give a little bit of time and a little bit of space to whatever it was that we were frustrated about. And typically speaking, we can come back to it and have a completely different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then even go into, like you were saying, where, you know, I can be like, hey, I really see this in you. And I know that you can be this person. And like, you do the same with me. And those words are very powerful and uplifting. Like, oh, like you actually see something really valuable in me, as opposed to you attacking them and saying, oh, you never do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I, I just can't believe that, you never do this thing. And
Yeah, you always do
you,
that thing.
right. Because then that just attacks you. Like you just get super defensive. You're like, well, I do that,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
What's funny is it's funny you mentioned the like anxious thing and looking back on it and going through, this I used to do. It's funny because in my previous marriage, I used it used to be the opposite, right? Where I'd be like, no, we need to solve this right now.
Mhm.
And then I started learning, well, okay, that didn't work, right? Otherwise I wouldn't be divorced, right? And then so, okay, well, let me try the opposite, right? And then I went too far the opposite way. And I'm like, no, we're just not going to talk about this. And I think in a lot of ways, though, in the beginning of our relationship, that was part of what made you anxious was it would get kind of swept under the rug and pushed down,
Mhm.
right? But now it's like sometimes there's not a finite timeline of, hey, in exactly 12 hours, we're going to deal with this,
Yeah.
right? But and even now, like we've worked through a lot of the stuff that we were struggling with this last weekend, and there's still a major one that we need to address, right?
Yeah.
But it's not a bad thing. And it's more or less of like, hey, let's come up with a plan of how our household is going to run together with the kids and all that sort of stuff. And what's really funny is by us taking, or I guess interesting, is by us taking the time and taking the break, we both came to the same conclusion and basically giving ourselves, I think it was 24 hours before we came back to that specific item, was like, hey, we were arguing about ABC, and what's really silly about that, or disagreeing, or whatever you want to call it, right? I just call it arguing, but it's, it's funny. I've told this story a few times, but like most relationships think of this crazy outburst, yelling, screaming match of like arguing,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't do that. So I
Yeah.
hate even like labeling it as arguing, right? Because like our voices don't even hardly raise. And like I think in any sort of conversation, when there is emotion, whether it's happiness, sadness, whatever it is, your tone will come up a little bit.
Yeah.
But I'm like, there's still inside voices in a
Yeah.
lot of cases, right? And I'm like, we don't have these disagreements where we're raising our voice at each other, we're saying all these things or whatever. So I hate even calling them arguments, but what I was getting at here is just the fact that we were arguing about ABC, and then we took 24 hours to essentially come back and identify, well, no, our core issue is XYZ,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're arguing about this, and you have this issue, and I have the same issue, but we're disagreeing with each other, even though we both have the same issue.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, by the way, if we just sat down and actually communicated and came up with an actual plan instead of just having expectations that we haven't communicated, it would solve this,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like I said, we had our issue. We gave it some time. 24 hours later, I think it was you said, hey, I really think that this is what's going on. This is the root cause. This is where I'm like, it's funny because that's literally exactly what I was thinking. And also, here's a plan of how we're going to solve it. So we'll take some time and sit down and do this. Right.
Yeah.
And like I said, we haven't taken the time just yet. We've also had other stuff we were taking care of, but it's still on our list of, even probably after this podcast, we'll sit down, address that, come up with a plan, and take care of it. And that's just a vastly different situation than, like I said, these crazy screaming matches, and then nothing gets resolved. And then one partner's anxious and wants everything solved now, and the other partner's avoidant. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I want nothing to do with you. And then you say a bunch of crazy stuff like, you never, you always,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm leaving, or I'm going to leave if you don't do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? When in reality, it's, hey, I see potential in you. I know this is who you are. This is the version of you I need. This is a version of you our family needs. And then on the flip side, hey, I hear you. I'm really struggling with this. I just need a little bit of space so I can put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and we'll handle this.
Right.
Right? Two vastly different ways to say the same thing.
For sure.
So, anyways, on that note, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah. We've got a
And
lot of stuff we can add on to this, but I think we need to do separate podcasts for all the other little things.
before we go, though, I do want to challenge everybody to identify 2 to 3 words that you use in your arguments or disagreements with your spouse or your partner. Write them down and take those 2 to 3 things that are common, that maybe you say something, but that's not exactly what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
Identify what your feelings and emotions are in those moments and what makes you say that. And then identify what you actually want to say, if you could clearly communicate it in a calm space and just write down your feelings, take that to your partner, talk to them about that and say, hey, I know that I do this. I know that I say these things. This is what I mean. And you make an agreement with your partner to start with at least one or two of those and get rid of them from your vocabulary and don't use them anymore.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good one.
On that note, guys, thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next go round.
Bye, guys.